Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I did not overlap with Keith Thompson at Yale, but we've had the fortune to meet in various dinners since that time, so it's a pleasure to be here. In my career as an ornithologist, I have the pleasure to have worked on lots of different topics. The origin of feathers, the dinosaur origin of birds, the physics and chemistry of bird color, behavior, etc., phylogeny. But and for many years I just thought this was weird stuff that Rick is into. I didn't look for a synthesis or for a connection. And then suddenly realized I do have a worldview in the recent years. And it's been surrounded by an important topic, a motivating topic for me, and that is the beauty of birds. Of course, that motivates my work, or a lot of my research on birds, but what I mean is not beauty to us, but beauty to the birds themselves, and to the scientific fact that birds are beautiful because they're beautiful to themselves, that they are agents, active agents in their own evolution, right? So it's that research that I want to talk about today. So a lot of my work has been what I refer to as broadly as beauty studies. Sometimes that's physics, like the optics of these nanostructural colors or these unusual pigments. It's included analyses of bird song and the anatomy of a bird's view. But to start with, I want to give you a challenge of what before beauty studies, so the extremity of the challenge that we have in evolutionary biology to explain the diversity of life. And this is an image from a video taken by my student, Ed Scholes, former student now at Cornell. And this is a male bird of paradise, superb bird of paradise. And notice that the eye is actually black. Now he is a polygynous bird. The female does all the nesting, and she visits in various males and chooses her mate. If we listen carefully, you'll hear the snap of his wings. Here's the female approaching the male. What we have is this incredible photonic nanostructure making that structural color. We actually have a paper in press on the structural absorption, the super black feathers that surround that. Of course, there are muscles necessary to erect these feathers. There's a mechanical sound he's making with flapping his wings. And if you watch, you can see how long he's breathing, frozen, and being regarded by that female time. Now, most of my colleagues in evolutionary biology believe that extraordinary beauty like that evolves because it provides information about objective mate quality that mates need to know. So information like who are his people? Does he come from a good egg or a good nest? What is his diet? Is his health okay? What does he smoke? Or even what is he smoking, perhaps? And this is where somehow my birdwatching roots and the way that I put together my experience of the natural history of birds with my intellectual work on the science side, I have come to a very different conclusion, one that started in grad school in the 80s and has continued on. And I'm going to describe this alternative, this broader alternative, as a process that I will refer to as sorry, that's a little loud. Okay. So as aesthetic evolution. In this case, aesthetic evolution is an emergent consequence of three necessary events: sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice. And when those choices occur on a heritable substrate, then we get the evolution of a feature that functions not entirely in the physical world, but in the cognitive domain within the sensory perceptions and the brains of conspecifics or other individuals. Those choices can take place in an ecological context, such as in a flower, or social context, like the interactions among male and female blue jays. It can be even parental, the evolution of cuteness, where parent birds are putting worms and food into the mouths of baby birds, leading to the evolution of extraordinary ornaments that are both attractive and singular. But what I'll be focusing in today is on the evolution of sexual beauty. And in that regard, I need to, in order to bring beauty back into the sciences, I need to come up with a scientific definition, one that I think will hold up. Of course, this is an old task. Aesthetic philosophers from Kant all the way on have had tried to distinguish beauty from merely any other kind of attraction. And I try to do the same. So beauty is not merely attraction. Beauty is a co-evolved attraction, where the form of desire and the object of desire have shaped one another over time. And I'm going to propose in nature, and mostly in animals, this occurs in a genetic context, a genetic coevolution. But it can also occur as a cultural phenomenon, cultural coevolution, such as the learned bird songs of things like wood thrushes. What this means is that beauty is not inherent in the object or in the eye of the beholder, but is a relation, a historical relation between the correspondence of those two things and how it got that way. Of course, aesthetic evolution has deep and, the most authentic roots possible. It goes back to Darwin. Now, after the publication of The Origin, Darwin had numerous intellectual problems. In particular, he had no theory of genetics or inheritance. He had no articulated theory of the origin of humans, and he had no theory of what he called the origin of impracticable beauty. And in fact, soon after the publication of The Origin, he wrote to his American friend Asa Gray and said, "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." And indeed, Darwin looks a little sick there, I think, doesn't he? And I think Keith has been one of the ones to focus in on Darwin's own personal life and its role in his science. Well, indeed, Darwin was a revolutionary mind. I think we've underestimated him. I'm in an embarrassed situation to say that Darwin is actually way more interesting than most of us understand. And he wheeled around in a foxy way, and instead of promulgating more of the same ideas, he came out 12 years later with The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, where he tackled two of these big problems, origin of humans and sexual selection. And he proposed a model of sexual selection that included both male-male competition, mostly male competition within a sex for control, leading to the evolution of armaments, and competition among, or choice among sexes, that is, a choice by one sex for mates of the other sex, often female. Now, Darwin's, I'll be focusing on this latter, mate choice, or evolution by mate choice for the rest of today. So Darwin, in description of his idea, used ordinary language, the ordinary language of human aesthetics, of judgment of art and beauty. He described mate choices as, or mating preferences as an aesthetic faculty or as standards of beauty. And he stated that the most refined beauty, in the case of the Argus pheasant, may serve as a visual charm, as a sexual charm, and for no other purpose. And this outlines that Darwin saw sexual selection as entirely distinct from natural selection, a distinct form. And Darwin's theory was also co-evolutionary. So here in this passage of describing again Argus pheasant, he says, the Argus pheasant acquired his beauty gradually through the preference of females during many generations for more highly ornamented males. The aesthetic capacity of females advanced through exercise or habit. This is our own taste. It's gradually improved. So this is a description of the relation, the coevolution between desire and the objects of desire. Now, Darwin's theory of male-male competition as structuring a large portion of the natural world were so congruent with the Victorian era and the social construction at that time that that the theory was immediately popular. However, his idea that female choice was a major force, and autonomous freedom of choice by females was a major force in evolutionary biology, was basically a big loser. The immediate responses to it in review in mere month were explicitly misogynistic and also claiming that Darwin was a traitor to his own cause. That is, by abandoning or threatening the power of natural selection to explain organic evolution, he had abandoned his own cause. Now, the most vociferous and persistent and successful critic was, of course, the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, right? And Wallace said all sorts of interesting and creative things, like he described that the viscera and the liver and the spleen are all brightly colored. And so the peacock's feathers was just an example of the same thing on the outside, right? Now, this is kind of an interesting structuralist Evo-Devo kind of explanation, but of course it's really what we refer to technically as a crock. That makes no sense. Of course, Wallace was correct in identifying that natural selection is an important source on the appearance of animals. But he couldn't discredit natural mate choice entirely. But when he did, he made a very interesting intellectual move. And here he states in a book in 1895, he says, the only way we can, in a passage referred to as natural selection neutralizing sexual selection, he says, the only way we can account for the observed facts, ornament in birds, is by supposing that color and ornament are strictly correlated with health, vigor, and general fitness to survive. Well, this is interesting because Wallace is credited with having killed the theory of sexual selection. In fact, it didn't come back as a popular subject for biological discourse until about 1971, an entire century after the book. And yet here he is articulating exactly the idea that mate choice is about detecting objective quality. This sentence would be at home in any paper in sexual selection literature today, perhaps any paper that wasn't written by me. Because in fact, my view is still in the real minority. So how did this work? How is it that he managed to discredit natural selection or discredit sexual selection and yet articulate the modern basis for which it's based entirely? The fact is that his switch was rhetorical. He took those elements from sexual selection that he liked, redefined them as a kind of natural selection, and then rejected the others. So what is it left for him to reject? What he rejected was the aesthetic, the role that individual animal agency and desire and pleasure was any kind of driving force in nature, right? Now, Darwin and Wallace debated on this for years until Darwin's death. Darwin didn't give an inch and died in 1883, but 6 years later, Wallace published his book, Darwinism. And in the current pages, in the opening pages, he writes, even in rejecting that phase of sexual selection, depending on female choice, I insist upon the greater efficacy of natural selection. This is preeminently the Darwinian doctrine, and therefore I claim for my book the position of being the advocate of pure Darwinism. So here Darwin's been dead for 6 years, and Wallace is claiming to be more Darwinian than Darwin. Now it's 140-odd years later, and I'm still pissed. And I hope that you will be too. Because this event, this insistence on the greater efficacy of natural selection, is the origin of what I refer to as adaptationism. The idea that adaptation by natural selection is a strong force that dominates all other aspects, all the interesting aspects. And along with sexual selection, phylogeny and an interest in animal behavior and development, all these other areas of the richness of a truly Darwinian view were also left out of science. This is why I describe the aesthetic evolution as Darwin's really dangerous idea. An idea so dangerous that it had to be drummed out of Darwinism because it was a threat to the power of natural selection as a strong force to dictate all that's known in evolutionary. Well, I'm really having fun here because this clock up here still says 20. but lucky on my laptop, I have a real clock running. So I won't abuse this error here. So usually in a longer opportunity, well, if Kip Thorne can describe gravity waves, their prediction, discovery, measurement, and future in 20 minutes, I could do this. But I'm going to skip this part, which is the genetics, right? And in typical, I'll get more into how genetic variation in preference and trait will result in a covariance, which means that when females select on males that they prefer, they are indirectly selecting also on preference, creating a self-organizing engine for the evolutionary elaboration of preference, and how that gives rise to a line of equilibrium and various hypotheses about how it could evolve there, right? So, but I'm going to try to give you a take-home version that I hope you can describe to anyone when they ask, what did you see in Philadelphia? And the answer is I'm going to compare the value of beauty to the value of money and try to elaborate the difference between the Wallacean and Darwinian, the aesthetic and the honest signaling paradigms, the fully aesthetic. And that is originally under the gold standard, the dollar had value because it stood in lieu of a tiny piece of gold in Fort Knox, right? So in this case, under the gold standard, the value of money is extrinsic to the money. It's in the gold. Don't ask why gold is valuable. That's just another difficulty with how we might create a non-arbitrary form of value. Now, all currencies from Bitcoin to dollars today are not on the gold standard. And without the gold, the value of money is intrinsic. It's the money itself. And value becomes what Samuelson described as a social contrivance. Right? It's a result of the shared faith and belief and actually interest and profit that people share in endowing the money with value that give it the rise. Yeah, 1408, mine says. Okay, sorry. And so what this is right here is the description of the genetics of that mechanism of social contrivance, but it would have lots to do with other such. So most of my colleagues in evolutionary biology are on the gold standard. They believe that the value of the peacock's tail is not in the tail itself, but is in some other sort of benefit. The direct benefit of lots of worms and good protection, or good genes. The indirect benefit of genes, right? So those are the two ways. The alternative, of course, is that it's beauty itself that is at stake. That beauty is merely intrinsic. Now, for some 10 years or more, I've been working with this, and I realize this is a market loser. This is not gaining lots of... So I have a new slogan to describe what is beauty off the gold standard, and I call it beauty happens. Right? And what that means is whenever you have sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice, then beauty happens. Right? It is a self-organizing process in the way that it is established. Now, we have a challenge. How do we proceed in science? So we'd go with how do we compare the Wallacean and the Darwinian? Well, I think one way to do that is to imagine the following scenario. What happens at the end of the rainbow? Right? Now, is the beauty of the rainbow intrinsic or extrinsic? Well, there's a long tradition of proposing that the beauty of the rainbow is extrinsic, and it comes from leprechauns, who state that at the end of the rainbow, there is a pot of gold. And so for my colleagues in evolutionary biology, most people believe that sexual ornaments are like rainbows, leading to an extrinsic benefit, either good genes or worms, or protection for your young. That the value of the beauty is not in the beauty, but out here. Right? Now, the question becomes, what would you think if a leprechaun came up and said there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? Well, besides maybe after the shock of imagining why this rainbow is here, or why the leprechaun suddenly appeared, you'll state, well, show me the money. Where's the money, right? So the burden of proof in this evolutionary debate between the Wallacean and the Darwinian is actually on the idea that the beauty is especially associated with an extrinsic benefit. So the burden of proof is on the leprechaun, and I hope that by putting this leprechaun hat on Alfred Russel Wallace, you can never forget this proposal, right? So the bottom line is that the Wallacean and adaptationist view and the Darwinian aesthetic view differ in many ways. The Wallacean view is based on a belief in the singular power of adaptation. Remember Wallace's line, I insist upon the greater efficacy of natural selection, which is still the primary defense of adaptationism when it occurs in biology today. It's also the notion that sexual selection is a form of natural selection, a synonymized possibility. It chooses to explain away the agency of animals as another kind of utility, to tame beauty and desire in a new way. And it also states that in this case, that synthesis and reductionism are fundamental scientific values. That a synthetic or reduced answer that actually explains less is preferable because of this unity. Right? In contrast, Darwin himself, I think, was a foxy pluralist. And so in the other category, the other column, we have the acceptance of multiple evolutionary mechanisms, including sexual and natural selection, as distinct forms. It recognizes individual agencies and places it at the center of what needs to be explained in biology, and recognizes that pluralism and the recognition of emergent processes are fundamental scientific values. So there's a lot at stake. This idea will require some big changes in evolutionary biology. One of them has to do fundamentally with the definition of sexual selection and the idea of fitness. Now, Darwin, of course, distinguished natural and sexual selection, and originally he described the term fitness entirely in terms of the phenotype. It was a capacity of an individual to further their own survival or fecundity. Right? Now, in the 20th century, during the population genetic era, fitness was redefined in a mathematical way as the relative contribution of one's genes to subsequent populations. And then this redefinition was in the period when sexual selection had been rejected. And so as a result, the redefinition concatenates, combines, flattens the complexity of the Darwinian worldview into a singular one. And of course, the concept of fitness retained its romantic association with the powerful idea of adaptation by natural selection, even though it had been redefined to include more than Darwin did. So it is actually now, because of this problem, it's actually impossible to be authentically Darwinian in modern language, right? And this is why fitness is now a word that I no longer use, right? Because I think it's really quite, it's problematical. So I would propose for those working on science textbooks or who have effect on curriculums that we need to recognize sexual selection as a fifth evolutionary mechanism, distinct, along with mutation, recombination, drift, natural selection, and sexual selection. And that adaptive mate choice, that phenomena that people are many interested in, is plausible and possible. The Wallisian idea is a result of the interaction of these two, right? So what this means is that there are other kinds of aesthetic evolution that can occur, not just beauty. Aposematism, for example, the warning coloration as seen in these wild these animals like the toxics, the snake and the rattlesnake or the wasp, etc. That are venomous or noxious, is an example of an aesthetic of revulsion, an aesthetic of horror. Right, where sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and choice are going on, but in the opposite way, not just attraction. So nature doesn't just do beauty, it does revulsion. So I hope I introduced you to the concept of aesthetic evolution, and this is now accurate? Your clock? Cool, great, excellent. Okay, so it occurs, as I said, in a variety of contexts, animals, etc. And now, if you enjoyed this, I hope that you can pick up a copy of The Evolution of Beauty, available wherever books are sold. And I hope that you give it to your children and grandchildren, because this is really about recruitment. Science is going to change by getting young people into it who are attracted to this version of science. Now, early on in this work, I became really fascinated by aesthetics and started reading more broadly outside of evolutionary biology. I thought that I would find allies in my scientific argument. I found myself becoming fascinated by the topic, and ultimately I reached the hubris moment, perhaps overreach, but where I thought, wait a minute, I have something to contribute here. And the person that, or the writer that really inspired me was Arthur Danto, who a philosopher and art critic who published a fantastic paper on the art world, in which he said, suppose one thinks of the discovery of a whole new class of art as something analogous to the discovery of a new class of facts anywhere, viz. As something for theoreticians to explain. And so this led me to imagine aesthetics as a coevolutionary phenomenon more broadly, and to examine the coevolutionary of art, both in human and in non-human art worlds. So in this work, I've defined art as a form of communication that co-evolves with its evaluation. And that means co-evolving either culturally as these objects, or bird songs, many bird songs, or genetically as in the peacock's tail. So what this implies is that there are many human art worlds and many aesthetic or biotic art worlds that outside of humans. In this work, I've tried to defend this account from all sorts of other things. I won't go into this, but what I'll say is that this is an aesthetic definition of art. That is, where art is always evolved with aesthetics. And it involves, many people, including Danto, have examined or analyzed the transformation of art. But because I'm defining art and aesthetics in interlocked way, I would like to refer to this as a transformation of the aesthetic. These are all art objects that transform the audience's and capacity to imagine what art could be and do at various times that led to feedback onto the art world, which led to revolutionary changes in production and evaluation. So there's the similar kind of coalitionary response. So why might we do this? Many people might think that including birdsong and flowers and rattlesnakes as art would be hopelessly confusing. I think that it adds to the ontological richness of art, but I have other reasons for thinking this might work, and that is that we have here as a concept in framing the problem. In cosmology, of course, over centuries and centuries, we've seen with added knowledge a continued decentering of humanness from the organizing center of the cosmos. And what that means, we've moved from everything revolving around us to sitting on, well, a quite specially sized and planet with a correct distance from its sun, but otherwise a quite arbitrary, maybe ridiculously arbitrary place in the universe. And so if if we can endure that decentering, well, I think we can endure the prospect that that art might be a phenomenon that's broader than people. So this is an explicitly post-human attempt to talk about science and the arts, and it's not an attempt to take over the arts from the sciences, but really the idea of identifying a kind of research program that begins at art, or begins at science and extends all the way to art in a way that's continuous without break. So with that, I'll end a little early and say thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Well, I think, okay, I seem to be here and then this one, thank you.
Hi. You started by showing how we've misunderstood
Oh, thank you.
Darwinism. And the crux of your argument was to redefine art. So my question is, what isn't art? You gave us those three criteria, and in the coevolution of the evaluation and the beauty, but is war art? Is surgery art? Is computer programming art? And
Well,
in some sense, if you say yes, then what isn't art?
No, I don't think that all surgery is art. If a surgeon says, well, unless it's a cosmetic surgery, which would be art, if a surgeon said, boy, that's a beautiful incision, and it fails to do the job correctly, then that's a failure. That is, so surgery is not art. I think that language and how to set up a piece of furniture from IKEA is not trying to please you. It works if you get the furniture set up and you don't lose your temper. But it's not whether you like it or not. And so by evaluation, I'm referring not just does it do a sufficient job in an objective way, but are you pleased? What is your affective response to it? It's about your subjective experience, not about quality. So there's many things that are not art. And so I think there are elements of languages that are not art, and there are elements of language and its change that are. And that's an interesting thing. But what's interesting, I talk about all the different, the history of different kinds of definitions of art. And in fact, in aesthetic philosophy today, people don't agree on anything about what art is. And the only thing they agree is that they're not going to let their disagreements destroy the field. At the discipline, right? And so to actually identify a genuine, objectively true class of natural things that occur in this box and saying, let's examine whether that is art and see how productive it is.
Thank you. I think we have a question over
Yes.
here.
Hi, Ellen Winner from Cambridge, Mass. I'm very sympathetic to the view for beauty for its own sake, but I wondered what the evidence would have to be to have us to allow us to choose between that view versus beauty as a sign of, if I can use the word, fitness. Yeah,
so what scientists need to do is go to nature and look for that pot of gold. And currently, there's lots of evidence of good genes. Well, there's not much evidence of good genes. A little bit of evidence of good genes, but other kinds of direct benefits. But unfortunately, what happens now in science is that people look to try to establish that adaptive advantage of beauty. And when they find it, they claim that the theory is supported. When they don't find it, they merely conclude that they haven't worked hard enough to find it. And that is a faith-based way to proceed. And that is why the textbooks include the theory of Fisher and Landy and Kirkpatrick, the mathematics of social contrivance, but does not actually include any examples of it having occurred in nature. And that's because we have the burden of proof is the opposite in current biology. that's how I would proceed.
I think we have one in the balcony.
Yes, sir.
Ernest Green, Los Angeles. Don't you think that some of the reason that many would reject or at least resist your position is because it would require too much assertion of consciousness to these animals?
I don't think so. In fact, I mean, that was a big barrier to the Victorians in response to Darwin. But today, biologists imagine all the same evaluative and critical faculties. They just think that they're shaped by natural selection. And that's how, there's really no difference between me and other biologists on what we are cognitively assuming about the animal's capacities to make judgments.
I'm going to take just... Oh, okay, and then the balcony.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Hi, Linda Greenhouse, New Haven. So as you were talking, I was remembering a talk here about 5 or 6 years ago by a woman who's an expert on dogs. And I had a chance to ask a question I've always wondered about, which is, in a dog park or whatever, would a dog of one breed naturally prefer to be with other dogs of the same breed? Can it say, you know, I'm a lab and I want to be with other labs? And what she said was, dogs are not very visual. They wouldn't look at another member of their breed and see their own breed, but their cue is behavior. Yeah. And so to the extent that the breed would have a distinct kind of behavior. So that raises a question, you know.
I think it's more fundamental than that. You know, that dogs do have preferences, but that artificial selection has prevented them from being enacted. And so as a result, dog breeds are the result of aesthetic evolution through selection by us on dogs. So it doesn't affect, and actually produce all kinds of decadence. Usually there's an association across many organisms between large body size and longevity, but it's the exact opposite in dogs, right? Large body dogs die younger, and that's showing that the direction of aesthetic evolution on dogs is going counter to the tradition or the direction of natural selection.
That wasn't quite my question. So my question was, when you're defining beauty as you know, visual, the beautiful peacock. So, but you know, from a dog's point of view, could it be sort of beautiful behavior? Could beauty be on a different scale?
They are, absolutely. And in a longer talk, I talk about the varieties of subjective experience and you know, the olfactory worlds of other organisms. So to dogs, beauty is olfactory, and that's why their desires are not associated with the breeds, because when we select on dogs, we don't change their olfactory. There's no coevolution between, as a result, between dog breeds or within a dog breed.
There's a question in the balcony, and then Jane Blumberg will have the last question.
Okay, so
Yes, ma'am.
up at the top.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nina Jablonski, State College. Thank you, Richard, for a very stimulating and exciting talk and a beautiful book. In cases of lavish sexual ornaments, like the antlers of the Irish elk, it's been pretty clear that something like aesthetic evolution has been driving this, even though people have tried to cloak it in sort of failed natural selection arguments. But ultimately, your mechanism has to interdigitate with natural selection, in that something like the physiological and physical excesses of the Irish elk's antlers were clearly eliminated ultimately by natural selection. So how can we bring these two together and really test the interaction of sexual and natural selection?
So I will resist going to more slides, because I got some beautiful slides to show this. But there in the book I talk about the club-winged manakin, which is a bird that sings with its wings, or males do. And what I propose has happened in them is a kind of decadence. The male, in order to make the wing songs, the pick, pick, wang, that females prefer, have solid radius, humerus, and ulna. This is extraordinary because even T-Rex has a hollow ulna. It predates that design, anatomical design predates the evolution of flight, right? So it's a major reversal. It turns out that female club-winged manakins also have an extraordinary ulna. And the reason is that the ulna develops in the egg before the embryo has a separate sex. So there's no way to get the male capacity to sing in this extraordinary way without transforming as well the anatomy of the female. Theoretically, there's nothing to prevent this process from leading to extinction. right? Because the fitness consequences on daughters, the lower fitness of daughters, is traded off by the sexual attractiveness of sons, and the whole thing can go around. And so one reporter said, when I was describing this, says, "You seem to be really enjoy that idea a lot of decadence." And I was like, I have to admit, I kind of do. But really, the reason why it's really interesting is because we see there the force of natural selection and sexual selection going in opposite directions. And that's when we really can see the value of separating their definitions to see them as distinct.
Okay, last question from Jane Bloomberg. Yes.
This is going back to your point about we humans putting ourselves at the center of the cosmos, and it also happens to touch on Linda's question. When we see these birds, they're obviously very beautiful, and birdsong is very beautiful to us humans. And from what I understand, birds don't perceive things, but the bird eye doesn't perceive things in the same way that the human eye does. How do we know that the birds are seeing other birds as beautiful in the way that we do? Maybe they're ugly to birds. Maybe some of those things are unattractive to birds.
That requires answers on a couple of levels. One, we know a lot about bird vision, and it turns out that birds see colors with a great deal more acuity and diversity and sensitivity than we have. We see RGB, and they see RGB UV. So their color world includes an entire dimension of colors we can't imagine, like ultraviolet yellow, which is a special kind of purple. It's as different from yellow as purple is from red or blue, right? A mixture of non-adjacent colors, right? And they use them in their plumages, right? So we know that on the perceptual side. The coevolution, we know that, bird beauty probably originated in the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, maybe back in theropod dinosaurs, and has been radiating among species ever since. Most species prefer themselves, and that is a prima facie evidence of rampant coevolution. 10,000 varieties, 10,000 standards of beauty, all evolved, radiated from a single ancestral form. And that means the form of the preference and the form of the beauty itself have co-evolved with one another. And so that gives us, I think, strong support for this notion. Well, the question is, why is it so attractive to humans? Well, a lot of these things are physics, right? The harmonic relationships between notes in a bird song are physical phenomena that represent the same in human music, right? These colors are also physical in their mixtures. I think one of the more outstanding questions is why do flowers smell beautiful? There are no genes in common between the olfactory systems of insects and humans, and yet they do. So that's a deep question in beauty studies. Thanks.
Thank you so much.